Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you everybody for being here. So I don't really have a good sense of audience composition today, but my goal was sort of to show you something that I wish I would have been shown a couple years ago, which is some intro to basic tools of how you can use R with text data, and in particular, thinking carefully about the type of data that we might be interested in as social scientists, as I am. I'm coming from a political science, international relations background. And so what the types of documents that I might be interested in, or people in my discipline might be interested in, look like, the data generating process behind that text, and how sometimes you don't need to go to the fanciest tools possible to do something meaningful with that data. At least in my experience, was what I was finding myself facing was that I would find a lot of great tutorials for text data that had examples that were very clear, but had nothing to do with the type of text that I would actually be working with. And then I would find very sophisticated application in my field. Then what I was missing was kind of like a middle ground of like an entry point in substantively aligned topics. And so this is sort of what I'm aiming to do today, to show you some of how myself and my team are using text data without being methodologists, right? Where we are substantive empirical researchers who do not develop new methodological techniques. We apply what exists, right? And who have been sort of self-teaching ourselves what some basic tools. So to situate what I'm going to be talking about in a bigger picture, I work on a Hi, welcome. I work on a Swiss National Science Foundation funded project entitled Evaluating the Pursuit of International Development Norms through Peer Reviews, Evidence from the OECD Development Assistance Committee, with Professor Dietrich, who's in the Political Science and International Department here in Geneva. The big question that we're trying to get to is how international organizations create and spread norms to influence the behavior of the countries that are the members. And in particular, we look at the OECD and we look at the issue or the topic, let's say, of international development cooperation, so foreign aid giving, right? So there's a bunch of countries that for decades have been giving foreign aid. They meet in an international organization to sort of decide what the best way to give foreign aid is. How do they go about doing that, right? Can we use text from the organization to understand better how these countries organize their aid giving? Yeah, just to give you a quick sense, there is within the OECD this Development Assistance Committee body that is where the data is going to be coming from. This body uses soft law, or sort of like organization, how can I call it, like horizontal governance type of tools to promote learning among its members. And one of them is the peer review mechanism, which is going to be the chief source of data, text data here. So again, just as the background, this is the premier or international organization that governs traditional aid giving. Think of like all traditional Western donors, European donors, North American, Australia, Japan, Korea, New Zealand. And what happens is that every couple of years, each member of this organization gets a peer review. So 2 other members plus members of the organization go in and evaluate its aid giving. And we have collected the entire corpus of documents that are produced through this peer review system, which are a little over 500 reviews, starting when the system started in 1962 and up until 2020. Right? With these documents, what we noted is that there's always a part of the document that's called the Secretariat's report. What we found out through qualitative interviews and research in the archives is that this report is not written by the two peer examiners. It is written by organizational staff. This is important because we want to understand the data generating process of your text data. So you want as much as possible to have a sense of who wrote the words that you're trying to crunch numbers out of. Because that's also going to inform the type of expectations that you might have, right? So before we found this out, we were really thinking about sort of strategic interactions. What if like you get evaluated by a fellow member that you're aligned with, that you have similar preferences to, versus if you get evaluated by someone that's more of an enemy, even though this is a very homogeneous group of donors, they still have different preferences and they do get into arguments about stuff, right? But come to find out that these two peers that review you participate in these field visits. So they go and visit the home country of the member that's getting the review. They also go and visit some of its recipient countries, but then just send memos, notes to the staffers at the organization. We were not able to get our hands on the memos, right? So again, when you're thinking about text data, what is the text that you most likely would want to, most likely would need, and what is the data that you can actually get? So then what we also learn is that this report that is written mostly by the organization staff is discussed with the donor that's getting a review in a meeting, right? And for some of these 517 reviews, more specifically all the way up to 1993, the report that we got is the version that was discussed in the meeting. So the report that was prepared before the meeting and then was up for discussion in the meeting. From data from 1994 to 2020, instead we have the post-meeting reports, right? So again, you have to use your brain here and think about comparability and think about whether reports that are circulated before the meeting might be systematically different from reports that are circulated after a meeting, right? You might believe that during the meeting, the donor under review might be able to maybe renegotiate some of the language, have it become a little less harsh, right? All of this is to just point out ways in which understanding the data generating process is important, just as important as understanding the R code, right? So then at the end, they publish a final peer review document, which includes the secretariat report. And it also includes like a TLDR portion at the beginning, which is titled something like Summary and Recommendations, where there's like bullet pointed takeaways. And so there too, we realize that the language in this front section is different than the language in the full report. And we also understand that many fewer people actually read the full report than people who read the summary and recommendation, right? And so we think about maybe analyzing those two parts differently and having different expectations for the type of language that would be in the different parts. So what does this universe of peer reviews look like? I'm about to populate this figure. It starts, let me start by pointing out that on the X, you have the time. On the Y, you have every country that is a member of this organization. And now dots are going to appear to indicate reviews, right? So you can see that in the early years, reviews were occurring every year for each country. And then over time, they became more rare. What we find by qualitatively looking through these documents is that they became longer and more extensive. So they probably became too much to do once a year. Also, you can notice that the membership of the organization grew, right? So some countries were original members already in 1962, like the US, the UK, right? Netherlands, Italy, Japan. But then you have countries that only joined very recently, like Slovenia and the Slovak Republic. So as the membership grew, it also became impossible to review everybody every year, right? So reviews become less frequent, but more comprehensive. And now some of these dots are going to turn pink to signal this divide in the data that I was just mentioning before, that all the documents that we have from 94 onwards are post-meeting documents, and all the documents that we have from 1962 to 1993 are pre-meeting documents. So we will not be analyzing those together because we have reason to believe that the language is different. And in fact, some of our work will be to show that the language is different, right? Okay. So then one more thing that I need to acquaint you with, if I'm going to show you some of this work, is the concept of tying foreign aid. If you're not familiar with it, the idea of tied aid is the idea of requiring that recipient countries use aid money to purchase goods and services from donor country providers, right? So if the United States wants to give agriculture support for, say, agricultural development in Bangladesh, but it forces that the money is used to buy agricultural supplies from John Deere, right? As opposed to going out in the world and finding the best price for agricultural supplies, that aid is considered tied, right? It doesn't, like, you don't need to have a degree in economics to realize that distorts markets quite a bit in prices. And so it has been very clearly shown, both like a macro level and anecdotally, that aid tying is bad for aid effectiveness. Yeah, not surprising. At the same time, aid tying is good for donor countries because it allows them to send back the money to their own providers, right? So there's this, let's say, mismatch in incentives when donors pay lip service to this idea that what they want to do with their aid is really to foster economic development in recipient countries, but then really engage in some practices that are known to hinder it, right? So what a great norm to have in international organization like the OECD DAC, to have an explicit norm against aid tying, right? Given that aid tying is recognized as bad for effectiveness, this international organization gets the consensus of its members together all the way to sign what they call like a capital R recommendation in 2001, where all the members agree that they're not gonna tie their foreign aid anymore. Obviously, there's like a list of exceptions to that recommendation. It was like, oh, food aid, we should still be able to tie it. Technical cooperation, we should still, but anyway, there's a clear norm here, right? Where members agree that they will not tie their aid, and we want to use the documents, the peer-reviewed documents that I was describing, to see how the compliance with this norm is evaluated. So just to give you a sense here on the practice side, so I'm going to populate this figure with data on actual aid tying practice. So on the Y, it's going to be what percentage of a donor's aid is tied over time. Here we're starting in 88 for data quality reasons. And I'm going to start by showing you the average across all DAC donors. You can see that they used to tie upwards of like close to 70% at the end of the 80s. And then over the course of the 90s, this agreement built, this consensus was built that aid tying is bad for development, culminating in the 2001 recommendation. We're down at like a little over 25%. And since then, we have been stagnating, let's say, between 20-ish and 25-ish%. Yeah. What is interesting, though, is that there is a lot of donor variation. This is the average, but if I plotted lines for each of the 30 donors, you would not be able to read this figure because it would look something like that. Yeah. And so this is not meant for you to be able to follow any one line, but just to show you that there is variation on the practice front. And so we want to see if there's also variation in how aid time is discussed in the document. And if there is a link between the practice and the discourse. So let's say that on the one hand, in a fair peer review system, we would expect that what matters is the reviewed donor's own track record, right? So if my aid given is being reviewed, how much foreign aid I have tied in the years prior to the review should be a good predictor of how aid time is discussed in my review. Does that sound reasonable? Right? So the track record of the donor under review in terms of how much aid they have tied in years prior to the review should predict amount of aid time discourse in the review. Right? This is, I think, a like sanity check almost expectation. But then we also wonder whether the organization might be evaluating different types of donors differently. And in particular, we have a sense qualitatively from having researched this organization that the organization might go easier on new donors. From the graph showing you the universe of reviews, you might have noticed that some Eastern European countries recently joined the organization. These are countries who went from being aid recipients to then transitioning into wanting to set up their own aid giving program, right? This organization, the DAC, wants to fold them in because if in the 60s, the DAC was the only organization and the DAC country were the only countries giving development assistance, today the landscape has changed quite a bit. You have China doing development assistance outside of the DAC with its own criteria and norms and practices, right? You have the Gulf countries, you have Brazil, you have other emerging economies that want to engage in some version of development assistance in a way that is outside of DAC parameters, right? Instead, the DAC wants to keep control over this phenomenon and would rather that new countries that want to become donors join the organization, stay in the organization, report data to the organization, and follow the practices that the organization says are the best aid giving practices, right? And so the notion here would be maybe for these new countries that are just joining, they might not be evaluated as harshly, right? So maybe if I'm evaluating the United States, who's been a member since the beginning, who signed the 2001 recommendation against aid tying, if I see that the United States has gone up in the amount that they tied aid, the organization and the peers should be kind of harsh with that type of behavior, right? Whereas if a new donor is just starting out and in order maybe to justify aid giving domestically, they do a little bit of aid tying, they might get off a little easier. At least this is a potential expectation. Yeah. And third and last, we have an expectation about whether there might be examiner effects. I was hinting at this before, right? Is it possible that it matters who reviews you, right? So imagine that I am a donor who still ties a bit much of my aid, and I go to review another donor who ties a bit of their aid. I might go easier on them because I myself have a guilty conscience on that issue, right? So here we'll be trying to see that if the new versus old status or this the practice of who's doing the reviewing also helps predict the amount of tied aid talk in a review. So how do we evaluate the discussion on the topic of tide aid in these reviews? I will then move to R and show you the process to how we get to this. But we settle on just looking at the prevalence of discourse by picking it up through a dictionary of keywords that we come up with. These are the set of keywords that we settle on. And so we look at mentions in the documents and scale them over the number of words in the document, given that document length varies a bit over time. We do extensive manual checks to look for potential false positives, and hopefully I'll convince you more when I go to R that this is a good strategy to pick up the discourse on tide aid. That's one thing I should convince you of. The second thing I should convince you of is that at least in this time frame, anytime a time is discussed, it is discussed in a negative way, right? There are never sentences that say, you should go and tie more of your aid, right? Instead, it is a topic that when discussed, it's always discussed to tell the donor, you should tie less of your aid, yeah? So we do this both separately for the Secretariat report section and from that front-end summary section, and then also combined to see like an overall measure. We also then look specifically at the front part of these documents to look for recommendations against aid time. These are explicit, like bullet pointed recommendation. So there will be a mix between something that I'm doing automatically in R and something that we did manually by reading every single recommendation in these documents. I mean, of course, we first flagged them using the same keywords, but then we read them manually to make sure that these are recommendations against aid time. So our outcomes here are going to be the prevalence of tide aid discourse measured like this, and a binary dummy for the presence of a recommendation against aid time. And this awful x-axis that I should kind of be jailed for, we have each of those 143 reviews. So each data point here is a document. They are ordered by year, so from 94 to 2020, and then alphabetically. And on the Y, you'll have the keyword prevalence. So the prevalence of discourse around tide aid. You can see that at most 0.3% of the words in a document have to do with aid time. And so what that distribution looks something like this, right? So what I want to point out here is that maybe if you squint, you might think that you're seeing a bit of a downward trend over time. But what's interesting to us is that there is a lot of variation within the same time periods, right? Within the same time, we're here in 94, by around here we get to 2001, the recommendation year. Around here it's 2010, and then up here it's 2020, right? There's still quite a bit of document level variation, which gives us confidence that maybe there is a link between what's in this document and the real world, but we'll see. So this was for the Secretariat report portion of the document, the one written by the staffers. Then we look at just the summary, same thing. You can see, however, that the range of the variable increases a bit in this front end section. Looks something like this. Notable that some of these documents now don't have any mentions of aid time whatsoever. That didn't happen when we looked at the entire, that happened once, pardon me. Ireland 94, no mentions in the report. But Ireland 94 does have a mention in the summary. So there's no document that never has any tide aid mentions. There are some documents that don't have any mentions in the summary. Some of these columns are about to turn pink to indicate the documents that also have a specific anti-A-time recommendation, those manually coded explicit recommendations, right? So to give you a sense by donor, I'm about to plot distribution. So for each of these donors, they've been reviewed multiple times. So I'm saying on average, what is the TIDATE keyword prevalence for all reviews of one particular donor, right? And the average looks something like this. The donors are ordered on the basis of this variable. But the distributions look like this, meaning that there also is variation within donor, right? It's not the case that some donors always get yelled at for A-time and some donors never do, right? There's quite a bit of variation even within donor. You can see that some donors have only been reviewed once. These are the new ones: Iceland, Slovenia, Czech Republic, Poland, Korea. Those are some of the newer donors that we only have one review for. But the other donors, you can see that there's kind of a bit of variation. Okay, so then, as I said, we have these recommendations that we coded manually. They look something like this. The US should continue to reduce the level of tide aid, including food aid. And so to remind you, we have these three expectations. We expect that as the reviewed donors' percentage of actual aid time increases, the percentage of tide aid mentions in the peer review should also increase. And then we wonder whether that relationship might be weaker for new donors. And then we wonder whether that relationship might be weaker when the peer examiners themselves are performing poorly on that metric. And here, I mean, it's not really, this is just to show you how we bring it all home in like a very early draft of a little paper. We have a bunch of regressions. In the first set, we're showing the percentage of aid-time in the 2 years before the review for the donor that's being reviewed are positively related with all of these potential outcomes. The amount of tide aid terminology in the full document, only in the report component, only in the summary component, and the binary presence of a recommendation, right? We then try to interact this variable with the old and new donor status or with the practice of the donors under review. And in both cases, we do not find any significant results for that interaction variable, right? So the takeaway there is kind of like we see a strong relationship between the practice of the donor under review and the content of the review, and no funny business with respect of whether the donor is new or old or who reviews whom, yeah? Then the last piece I want to show you, because I'll show you how I do this with an existing dictionary, is the question of where the evidence for the peer reviews come from. I mentioned that during the peer review process, delegates from the examiner countries and from the organization visit some recipient countries to gather evidence, right? And so we wonder where they choose to go, right? And more generally, what recipient countries are most featured in the reviews. Because if you think about it, these peer reviews are tools that the organization claims to be using to learn something about how donors give aid, right? But if we were to find that they always go and visit the same 5 donor darling recipient countries, for example, what they learn is going to be skewed, right, by inference that you can make if you only visit, you know, emerging democracies that are easy to travel to and easy to get data from, right? So we want to see in these documents which recipient countries are mentioned the most, right? And what comes in handy here is that there is this dictionary called the News Map. It's in our package by the same name. where basically this was originally built for analyzing news, so articles, and finding out what geographical locations are mentioned in news articles. Yeah. And what is so great is that it spares us the work to go and compile dictionaries for every single country, right? So if I was compiling this dictionary manually, I would have to think of every word that should count as a mention of Switzerland. So it might be Switzerland, Swiss, but it also might be Bern. So they use like the name of the capital, the name of the nationality, the name of the country. Sometimes countries might have slightly different name. Sometimes maybe for Switzerland, you want also their root like Helvetica, right? And so this package does this for you. I'll show it to you in R2. But essentially, it's already highlighting all of the keywords that could refer to any given country, yeah? And so what we do is to, through that dictionary, count the mentions of any recipient countries in the document to see which recipient countries that get mentioned the most. One question that we might have is whether recipients who get more aid are also discussed more. Again, that seems like a very straightforward expectation to have. Or whether recipients who are more important strategically, diplomatically, for whatever reason you might think of, get mentioned more. Or whether maybe recipients that make conducing a review easier, recipients that are easier to travel to, recipients who have higher statistical capacity in their government, so data might be easier to get, right? So to show you some preliminary descriptives here, I'm going to show you the correlation between the total foreign aid that a given recipient country has gotten between 1960 and 2019, and the number of times that same recipient is mentioned across the entire corpus of reviews. And as we might expect, it's a positive correlation, even though we have outliers on both sides, right? So for example, up here are countries that are mentioned quite a bit comparatively to receiving not a lot of aid. And down here, you have countries that get a lot of aid, like Egypt, Iraq, Israel, Afghanistan, but they are not mentioned as much in the reviews. And if you've studied international relations, if you thought about this a little bit, it might jump out to you that some of these recipients are more strategic recipients. These are not maybe recipients in which donors first and foremost really want to foster economic development, right? That's not the reason why, for example, Israel gets a lot of aid, right? So then it wouldn't make sense to carry out a peer review that heavily focus on recipients that are not even the ones where actually foreign aid is even supposed to do something. Does that make sense? Whereas up here, you might have recipients that are getting maybe less aid, but are places where donors claim at least to be actually trying to be doing some development action. But these might also be some of the donor darlings that are more open to having visitors and to opening up their books and showing their stats, etc. So then I think I'm going to show you a map for the peer reviews of France to see which recipients are most mentioned in the peer reviews of France. And you can see a heavy skew towards former French colonies, at least just at a glance as a general area. This is not surprising. France is a country that heavily targets its foreign aid towards its former colony to maintain some kind of neo-colonial tie, right? So not surprising. For the UK, the jokes write themselves. For the US, you see more like strategically important areas, the Middle East, yeah. For Sweden, just a strong relationship with the countries that receive a lot of its aid. Okay, so now to move to R to do some behind the scenes on this. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how we went from documents to TXT files. Then we took those TXT files and turned them into a corpus. We went through tokenizing and building a document feature matrix. We built our own dictionary through keywords and context searches. And then we use this existing dictionary in Newsmat. All right, so if that sounds reasonable, I shall transition to using some R. This over here. And here too, it'll be, I was a bit conflicted because if you have never done text analysis in R, a lot of this I need to go through. If you've done it a bunch, a lot of this will be redundant. So please be patient in either direction. Yes. Yeah, I'm gonna make it bigger, yeah. I'm just trying to put myself in a situation where I can, whoops. Okay, maybe, no signal. Why though? What if you stay down here? Still no signal? Okay, we're back. We are back. But R has disappeared in the meantime. It went up there. I lost my mouse. Nope. Okay, let's see. No. No. Too much? Good enough? Like this? Yeah? All right, so we start, I tend to use tidyverse. You don't have to. But that's what all of this coding is going to be using. And I like the Quantita package. Have you used the Quantita package before? Some of you, maybe, yeah. So Quantita is one of the key text analysis packages in R. And one of the best parts about it, if you are a social scientist, is that it was one of the main people who wrote it is a social scientist, he's a political scientist, so he also provides a lot of examples that are political science data. So I'm gonna go ahead and load that. And then I'm starting with read text to build my corpus. I also like to use Beeper. Anybody a fan of Beeper? Beeper just makes the sound when your code is done running. So if you have code like, I'll show you in a second. It also has a bunch of different sounds. And then I hate scientific notation, so I always do that. I'm gonna set my. Yep.
It's invisible from on Zoom. You are directing the camera on yourself.
No, yeah, I thought I was sharing the screen though. No?
No. We don't see the screen.
Okay, let's troubleshoot this. Sorry. You were seeing my slides before?
Yes.
And then somehow it gave up. Okay, let's try. Thank you for pointing it out. How about now?
Good.
All right, excellent.
Good. Very good.
So we have just set the working directory. And we're going to start by, well, let me first say something. Where do these documents come from? They mostly came from the organization's archives, meaning myself and some valiant research assistants went up to Paris in the DAC archives, were given boxes of stuff to go through. We reevaluated our life choices when we realized nobody else had looked at these documents since the day they were written. And so, who cares about this research question? Maybe just us, but it's part of the fun of what we get to do in academia, isn't it? So we unstapled staples that had been stapled, 40 years ago, and scanned the documents, luckily through really good scanning machines. So that's the first thing you might want to think of if you're doing something like that. Are you able to scan the original documents in scanning machines that already have some kind of OCRing software built into this, and that are going to produce really high quality PDF scans, right? So that's the first thing we did. Of course, some of the more recent documents that were used in the analysis I showed before for 94 onwards were already available in PDF, but most of the corpus was not, right? So that's what we first did. And I was first doing some of the analysis reading the PDF documents into R. That is something you can do, especially if you're doing a first run of your analysis. You do not necessarily have to go from PDF to TXT. You can have R through this package read text, read directly from your PDF documents, all right? Now, if these PDF documents are recent, that might work well. If they are older, or if they are in particular structures, like imagine a PDF document that has 2 columns of text per table, extremely common scenario, right? R might mix it up and read sentences across the 2 columns, yeah? So instead, if you want to make sure that you're taking care of that scenario, and also you might want to say, remove the headers, the footers, maybe the footnotes you don't care about, maybe the tables and figures you don't care about, right? Then you want to take the PDF and turn or extract from that PDF just the text that you're going to want to analyze. This is particularly important if your analysis are gonna be at a level of sentence or paragraph, right? This is another decision that you need to ask yourself. Do I care about the order of the words in this document? Or do I want to treat this as they say, a bag of words? The bag of words approach just throws all of the words of the document in an imaginary bag that you can shake, and you do not care about what word came before or after any given word, right? You just care about the presence of any given word, right? But more often than not, maybe that's not true, sometimes you do care about the order, right? In my case, I cared about the order in the extent that I wanted to read the sentences that have to do with a tying to make sure, that they actually had to do with a tying, and to get a sense of whether a tying was discussed in a positive, neutral, or a negative way, right? So if you care about the order of the words, if you have things like columns, tables, headers, and footers, you might want to go through this additional step that we did through a software called AbiFine Reader. There are more than one options for an OCRing software. A lot of people recommended this to us. We had a good experience. So essentially what this does is that it allows you to open your PDF document and automatically translate it into a TXT file, except it flags to you, it tries to predict to you things like if a word is, it can do everything from trying to recognize a typo and correct it to recognizing the structure, like the column thing, and pick up on sentences that are within a column, right? So what we did is that after doing some ourselves, we had a team of research assistants that went through each of these documents so that a human being was looking at the PDF, looking at the final TXT, and make sure that we had in TXT form the sentences, the text, as we were hoping to have them. And I think I have an example here just to show you. So this is, for example, the 93 review of Japan. This is one of the older documents that was manually scanned. So for example, even though the quality you can see is quite good for a scanned document, but it's not searchable. Yeah, this was not OCR'd. So I cannot go up here and search for tide, right? So instead, through Abby Find Reader, we go from this to, where is my TXT file? I need to move it over there. No, that was my last search in my email, I guess. Here I can, look for tide, right? So a human being went through this document and decided that this is a good representation of the stuff that we want out of that. Does that make sense? So from now on, what I will be working with is a bunch of these TXT files, one per review. What they also did when they did this task is that they separated the report from the early summary, right? So now I also have two separate TXT files, one with the report and one with the summary to see the differences between those sets. In the rest of the code today, I'm only going to use the reports. These are longer. They give us a little bit more stuff to look at. Okay. So this is a folder that contains all of those TXT files for all of the 517 Secretariat reports. And I'm asking R to read them out, given that they end in TXT. And I'm calling this item reps. And here I have this 517 item. It's going to take a second to load, but it's basically reading it with a document ID, which is the file name. And in here is the entirety of the text. They just all happen to start with, the similar title, but, this is the entire text. So then what I need to do is from this object, create a corpus. And the corpus in here is a different type of object in R. R understands a corpus to be a collection of documents, right? So from here on out, R knows that I'm going to be working with documents, including a lot of text in them, right? A corpus item here can have variables similar to a data set, right? So I can add variables to add additional information for each given document. If I look at it now, so this is the same way that you would look for the variables in a regular data frame, right? So if I look at this now, can you see the bottom here? Should I, let's bring it up a bit. Anyway. You can see that there is only one variable now. Sorry, that there are the variables that are there now are the TXT file names, right? What I'm about to do is create a variable called document ID. I'm about to use this variable to extract the year and the name of the country, so that for each item in this corpus, I can separate the year and the country in case I want to do country level analysis or year level analysis. This is just a naming convention that we created when we were scanning the documents. So your documents might have whatever name. We decided to name them this way because we knew this would be easy to then extract year and country information from them. All right, so here I'm looking at these variables. Right now I have 0 variables. I'm gonna create a variable called a document name, a variable called year, and a variable called donor ISO, the 3-letter code. So once I create them, you can see that I now have a data set. Let me scroll all the way up. I should have just printed the head. I have a data set that includes the document name, the year, the donor code, and then there will be the text associated with that. Okay. So then, I mean, I'm a fan of every once in a while clearing out my R and keeping only the stuff I knew going forward. So then what I want to show you next is the idea of tokenizing your corpus. This refers to getting down to the unit of word that you're interested in. So you want to isolate every single word in your document. And depending on what you're going to do with that, you might care to keep every single word, or you might care to get rid of some of them, right? For example, a very common thing to do is to remove what are called stop words. These are words like and, pronouns, common adverbs, also, if, right? Words that don't carry a lot of intrinsic meaning, right? Depending on your type of analysis, you might want to get rid of those words, or you might want to keep them. Another possibility that I'm not doing here, but is the idea of stemming the word. If you stem a word, it means that it goes down to its root. And if, for example, you stem this corpus, instead of keeping the words development, developing, developer, developed, right? All of those would get stemmed to develop asterisk, right? And only count as one thing, right? Again, you have to think theoretically and use your brain and your qualitative knowledge to decide whether something that makes sense for you or not. Other things that I'm choosing to get rid of here, I'm turning everything to lowercase because in my analysis, I don't care about uppercase, lowercase, right? I am removing punctuation, numbers, symbols, URLs, separators, hyphens, right? Again, this is something that you might or might not want to do. I'm just actually doing this to show you because then we'll go back to working with the corpus. And here's me using my beep for the first time. This is a step that you especially want to do if you're going to do the bag of words approach, right? So then you just have a bag of token for each document that includes all the words that are in that document, eliminating things like these stop words or eliminating numbers, figures, URLs, and so on. So this is going to take a little bit because I'm doing it on the full corpus. And you can see here that I have created a created an object that it's this token object. And I will with it redo some of the same operations. And that is because that was a beep. That is because sometimes it doesn't catch all of them. It's a bit finicky. So you want to like keep looking over and over at the data to see what your tokens look like. But I'm going to give it 2 more. So that is like a classic first step when you're doing text analysis in R. The second step is typically to create a document feature matrix. And this means that you're essentially creating a data set, a matrix, where each column is a word and each row is a document. And the value in each cell is the number of times that that particular word occurs in that particular document. Yeah. So again, here you have the possibility to remove and do some of the same operations you were doing before. And then I am here looking at the top 100 most common words. So unsurprisingly, the most common words in this corpus are development aid, countries. This should have been removed as a stop word, or it's most likely that it's been accidentally split, the per and the cent. It's probably, they used to be written as per hyphen cent, so I split them. Cooperation, assistance, right? Million program, nothing surprising here. So here I'm creating a data frame with that matrix. And if I look at the length, this is telling me how many unique words are in this corpus. Yeah. So if I open up, see how this data set has 517 row, 1 per document, and over 44,000 columns, 1 per word, right? This is one of the core objects that you use to do text analysis, because then you can sum them, you can do all kinds of things with them, right? But now I'm actually, so what I'm doing here is a very simple word count. So if I sum across an entire row, I will get a word count for that document. That's what I'm doing here. And the reason why I need some kind of standardized word count is that when I'm then gonna count dimensions of a time, I want to standardize by having a general word count, okay? So I've shown you tokenization, I've shown you how to make a document a feature matrix. The next thing we're gonna do is this thing called keywords in context, right? So we were talking before about whether we care about the position of a word in the text or not, right? If you care, you can use this tool of a keyword in context, which I like to use on a corpus object. Remember, the corpus object, we have done nothing to. We have not removed stop words from it. We have not done it lowercase. It remains as it was in the TXT file. And that's because I want to read those sentences as they appear in the original TXT file. So I want to look at mentions of a time in this corpus. And what I showed you in the slides before was the set of keywords that we eventually settle on. But how did we get to that list of keywords? First, it was some sort of qualitative brainstorming. I've also been recommended, and I think it works quite well at that stage. You can use something like ChatGPT to be like, you can ask a question like, when looking at international organization documents, what set of keywords would you use to pick up conversations around the topic of a time? And see what it gives, right? For us, actually, one of the reasons why we chose to focus on the topic of a tying, I won't lie, is the ease of the keywords, right? Because we have found that if one of these documents uses words related to tying, untying, tie, more often than not, it's talking about a tying. And on the flip side, in terms of potential false negatives, we do not see a lot of conversation of a time that does not mention the T word at all, right? So it is an easy topic to capture for this reason. But so what I do is I go through trial and error. So for example, here, I start by searching, and let me show you this neat little trick. Let's see if I remember, I think. If I, through this command, I'm asking it to search for the pattern tie aid, meaning TI and whatever else afterwards, space aid, right? In this corpus. And I'm asking it to spit out a window of 20 words before and after the phrase, right? So what I'm going to get once the music rings is a data set where each row is a mention, right? And it's gonna tell me the document it came from, the phrase that I was looking for, the actual phrase that it found. So for example, a bit more creative than just the regular beep, but you know, sometimes you have to give yourself something to live for on a working day. If this is the only thing you take away from today, I would be pleased with myself. Your office mates may be a little less pleased. But anyway, so let's look at this object that I just created, this tie date object. It tells me here, it looks ugly when we spit it out here, right? But it's telling me that it is what? It's telling me that it is a keywords in context object with 472 matches. It means that in that entire corpus of 517 documents, it found this phrase 472 times. And if I open it up here instead to view it as a data set, let me make it bigger. This is sort of the structure that I was trying to describe to you before. So it tells you in the document of this name, at this line, starting from this line, sort of, this is like the position in the document. Starting from this word to this word, we found this keyword, time aid, using this pattern. And these are the 20 words that occur before. And those are the 20 words after. So what I do is that I saved each of these and opened them in the comfort of my Excel and read through them a bit, right? And first of all, you can see all of the different keywords that are picked up with that pattern, see? Because it was TI asterisk, we picked up time aid, tide aid, titional aid, tide aid in caps, time-bound aid, right? And then we can kind of read the sentences, right? And for the purpose of matching tide aid credits offered by the donor countries, right? This is a sentence, it makes sense, right? So what I do so first I go through and read them a bit to get a sense of what the sentences look like around the time. And then to be a bit more systematic, here I go by printing the set of keywords that actually were captured by the phrase that I chose. And I look at each of them, right? So when I look at tie aid, there's only 3 of them. And just reading these sentences, certain cases, to tie aid to procurement, okay, that's talking about aid tying. The congressional requirement to tie aid means the goods procured with aid funds must originate from the US. Okay, that makes sense. It's a tied aid sentence. You see what I'm doing? I'm kind of like spot checking. Then one of the keywords that got picked up is tie up aid. I have no idea what tie up aid is. I've never heard of this before. Let's see where it comes up. I go like this, and I see that it's from one review, 2 mentions in one review from Japan in 93. The version with a capital T is also from that same review. I'm like, something's going on with this particular review. So I go and get the original document, realize I cannot search the original document. I then go to the TXT version of the document and I search this tie up thing, right? Tie up, I see there's this 87 bullet point next to it. So maybe I can go and find it in the actual document. I see that there's points. This is kind of the format here. So maybe I scroll the bottom and still only at 18. Where are we at here? At some point there must have been an 87. There we go. 87, tie up aid. I read this paragraph and I realize this has nothing to do with Thai aid. So I marked down in my script that when using this phrase, the true positives actually only come from mentions of Thai aid and Tide. Tie up, these are false positives. And then there was this time-bound aid, which I looked just here. The Australian government has stated that it does not currently support a time-bound aid target. That's nothing to do with Tide aid. So essentially, I'm going through manually, looking at what comes up with different keywords and marking what keywords get me true positive hits and what keywords get me false positive hits. And I do this for a bunch of different options. I'm not gonna go through each of them now with you, but then I tried the patterned tie with an asterisk at the beginning, because a common way to discuss this is in the negative of untying, right? But turns out that if you search for this, you get a whole lot of stuff that has nothing to do with a tying. I also found out that every time Thai is all caps is actually a typo for the. So I have to let go of all those mentions. I search for this pattern. I find for some false positives, some true positives. And essentially, this is the process that I went through to build my own dictionary to capture a topic that did not have an existing dictionary out there in the world. I'd say that this was a particularly easy case to do this for a number of reasons. One, like I said before, there is an obvious set of keywords about this topic. I've done, for example, the same analysis on the issue of foreign aid volatility. That is much trickier, because every time volatility or unpredictability or variability comes up, I have to make sure that it's referring to aid and not to food prices or to oil prices, right? So this was easy because of that reason. It's also easy because my corpus is only 517 documents. People work with corpuses that are way bigger than this, way bigger. But this, for me, this is a good size for me to be able to not really read every single sentence, but have a kind of a thorough set of checks. Once you scale it up, you might be willing to let in more of an error and be aware of what direction the error comes from. But I also think that this is representative of the lot of the research that I see in political science that might be looking at party manifestos. They're gonna be a lot such that you don't want to manually code them, but they're also not gonna be hundreds of thousands. They're gonna be in the realm of hundreds, maybe thousands, or parliamentary speeches, speeches that are given on the UN floor, documents produced by international organizations, like in this case, evaluations, reports, all of these things tend to be in the realm of maybe the thousands, where you could do an approach like this. So after I go through all of this, essentially what I learn is that I can use this and then exclude these two because they picked up false positives. I can use this, I can use this. I can use this if I exclude these two. I can use this. And ties is one that I didn't show you, but ties is one that picks up mostly false positives, because mostly the way that ties is used is maybe talking about economic ties between two countries or diplomatic ties, but every once in a while there is a true positive, right? So here the question for us as researcher is, one option is to just be conservative and remove. So the current version of the analysis just did not use ties mentioned, right? If we want to be thorough and we have the resources, because when I did ties, let's see, where is it? We are talking about, let's see, we're talking about some, for ties, we're talking about some 25,000 mentions. So it take a lot of human power to go through each of them and tell us which ones are the rare true positives. So for that reason, for now, we're like, let's just not use ties. More often than not, it does not pick up what we need, right? On the flip side, there is tie, which is mostly true positives, but sometimes it has a false positive. For example, there's a sentence, external aid should tie in with the national health policies. This is not a tied aid sentence, right? So in this case, for now, we are keeping it in, but we want to do manual checks because here for tie, I haven't searched them. I don't have the object up here now, but it is in the realm of like hundreds of mentions, not 25,000. So we can have an RA read every single sentence and flag the ones that are the few false positives, okay? So essentially that is how I build then, and I haven't run the code up to here because each time it takes a bit. But essentially then what I'm building is here I'm building a spreadsheet with or a data frame where each line is a mention. And then I can use those variables I created at the beginning to aggregate them either by document, which we use the most, or by country, or by year, or by like a combination. Does that make sense? Yes. Yeah. So I can share this code with you. The next part of the code that I'll just show you in a couple of minutes is to show you what an existing dictionary looks like. So that is it. Before we talked about a dictionary that we built. The news map dictionary that I was talking about before already exists. So just by loading this, installing the package and loading this library, you have this dictionary that I'm going to show you up here. This is what a dictionary looks like. So it looks like for every, they have continent groupings, then they have regional groupings, and then they have countries, right? So for the country of Burundi, which is abbreviated Burundi, we have a set of 3 keywords, one with the asterisk to get any possible ending, right? So if you imagine if you had to go and do this on your own, it would be a lot of work. Of course, then there's the work of like trying to merge this with whatever names you have in it, but it's much easier. So I just wanted to flag this as a possible resource because I think it's a pretty common thing to want to look for, mentions of countries or places. And so this could then also allow me to aggregate up to see how much do reviews talk about African recipients versus Asian recipients, or East African recipients or Sub-Saharan African recipients, right? So I'm going to stop here for now. I hope this was somewhat useful. Thank you again for having me and look forward to the discussion. Thank you. Yes, in the back. Yeah, so the results that we have so far, in terms of, in terms of the substantive research. Yeah. So in this case, we are okay with overfitting because we're not gonna use this on any other form. You know what I mean? So this is also something that I found myself having to adjust when I took machine learning classes or any kind of statistics class from, say, a statistics department. The focus is typically on prediction, right? And the focus is on building a tool that you're gonna then be able to use on other data, right? That's not at all what we do most of the time in the social science, right? So we are overfitting because I'm not thinking in 50 years, I'm gonna use the same tool on 500 more documents, right? But that's an excellent point and something you have to really think about because most of the time we're trying to explain patterns in a given set of data, and we're not trying to make predictions, right? Very good point. Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you ever had a situation where you were looking for keywords from different languages.
Yeah.
And does it affect the way you do the dictionary? Like,
Yeah.
because I'm thinking that if you work with something
Yeah.
other than English, then you have to.
For sure.
check
For sure.
the-
Yeah. So for example, in another part of this project, we are looking for aid. We're looking at aid that targets gender equality. So we were searching for keywords related to gender equality, women's rights, girls. And because this was not on these documents, but it was on donors reported aid activities, we were searching project titles and project descriptions. And some donors report those information in English and other donors in their native languages. So what we did is just sat down with native German, English, Italian, Portuguese, French, and Spanish speakers to try to come up with a similar set of keywords across the different languages. This was easy because we focused on languages that we basically had in our team, right? It would, of course, be more difficult if what's easy, for example, Korea in our data reports data in English. So we don't have to figure out the Korean set of keywords, right? By now, there are text data tools in many, many languages. For example, the Newsmap dictionary exists in like 5-6 languages, a good amount. So if you're using it on, because again, it was started for news, if you're using it on articles in different languages, that would work. Even just doing it manually, it became immediately clear that there were things that do not have one-to-one equivalent, right, in English versus, for example, in Italian, there's only one word that indicates both an abortion and a miscarriage, right? I don't know what it is in French or Spanish, but in English, it's two different words, two different things, right? And so if you're trying, for example, we were trying to see if organizations who fund abortions are getting money, right? That is different because an organization could like be targeting healthcare, including miscarriages, but not providing abortions, right? So I guess you have to be really aware qualitatively of the topic that you're trying to do this with. And having a native speaker of that language would be really useful. Honestly, what you see happen more and more is that papers from the social sciences that use text analysis more often than not now are composed of teams that include, yes, a social scientist, but also maybe a statistician, but also a linguist or computational linguist, that maybe is a linguist that's an expert in Arabic, and that's how come you're able to use news out of Middle Eastern newspapers, right? What we're doing here is like very, very simple compared to those things. And when you see more advanced things, more often than not, they come from interdisciplinary teams where you have experts on the translation or the more advanced sort of say like a topic. Here we tried doing some topic modeling to be less supervised in this approach, but it didn't really work for a time. But if we were to move more in that direction, we would probably then need to be assisted by somebody with a bit more skills in this. Yeah. Yes.
What about synonyms?
Yeah.
Because we're trying to combine the whole
Yeah. So we looked for those. I didn't, this was not the first situation that I'm showing this. And what is beautiful about this topic in this particular setting is that it's really rarely discussed through synonyms, because time has become such a buzzword. We became confident in only using that, because bound will get us way more false positives and maybe a couple true positives, but we decided to just let it go. In other topics, I think in most other topics, you would have to be way more careful with the synonyms. So when I was doing this with aid volatility, I had to think of the synonyms. Aid volatility is a tagline in my mind, but it's not necessarily the tagline, the name of the topic for everybody else involved. Aid time is the name of the topic for everybody else involved. And so this is, again, partly why we chose to do this topic, because it's easy to capture. But even in the gender, we had to think of so many synonyms. And for just the words girl, woman in different languages, they might have more synonyms. Children, childbearing, pregnancy. That's also what we use ChatGPT for, or just like a synonym dictionary for, to try to generate potential words and then test them manually, like I showed you. Like, just look at the hits that you get. And obviously, this is good to look for false and true positives. You don't know what you don't know, right? So it's a much worse process to try to assess the negatives, right? The false negatives, you wouldn't be able to get them with this. So it's more like your qualitative expertise about a topic and how that topic is discussed in a particular context. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. And so I started doing this before I was integrating ChatGPT, and I wanted, because I'm very risk averse and I like to have a very good hand on my data, I really wanted to look at these sentences myself and make decisions with myself. I think that is probably good. I mean, the caveat is that obviously this is a particular type of language, but it's not language that it's not trained in. It's the language that is in documents produced by IOs is all kind of written in a similar style. So, for example, I mean, there have been social scientists that like slightly adapt large language models, like Google Spirit model, to slightly fine-tune it to say, in this case, documents produced by international organizations. It's like marginally better, but it's not over the product, right? So my that's absolutely. Thank you again. This was really fun. Thanks for having me.